Okay, this article here is interesting. Trump's post-election tactics put him in unsavory company, denying defeat, claiming fraud, and using government machinery to reverse election results are the time-honored tools of dictators. It's by Andrew Higgins, Moscow. When strongman ruler of Belarus declared an implausible landslide victory in an election in August and had himself sworn in for a sixth term as president, the United States and other Western nations denounced what they said was brazen defiance of the voters' will. President Alexander G. Lukashenko's victory, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said last month, was fraud. Mr. Pompeo added, "We have opposed the fact that he's now inaugurated himself. We know what the people of Belarus want. They want something different." Just a month on, Mr. Pompeo's boss, President Trump, is now borrowing from Mr. Lukashenko's playbook, joining a club of truculent leaders who, regardless of what voters decide, declare themselves the winners of elections. The club counts as its members far more dictators, tyrants, and potentates than leaders of what used to be known as the free world, countries that, led by Washington, have for decades lectured others on the need to hold elections and respect the result. Remember when Jimmy Carter used to go travel around the world to observe elections? You know, like in Haiti and other countries. What happened to those days? The parallel is not exact. Mr. Trump participated in a free and fair democratic election. Most autocrats defy voters before they even vote, excluding real rivals from the ballot and swamping the airways with one-sided coverage. I can say that for sure because back in 2017, December 2017, I was in Cambodia, and all you see is, I think, the People's Party or something like that, the Cambodian People's Party, two men, that's it. The opposition is in prison, and I think his name is Hen Sen, the Prime Minister, Cambodia, and they have no real opposition, but they do have elections. So this article is exactly on point. This is the kind of stuff that goes on in some parts of the world. And all you see is these two guys, their pictures, all on the highway when you're riding on the highway or in somebody's backyard. You keep seeing the Cambodian People's Party and the picture of these two men all over Cambodia, no matter where you go. The pictures are ubiquitous everywhere. Okay, so there's little indication that Mr. Trump can overcome the laws and institutions that ensure the verdict of American voters will carry the day. Right? The country has a free press, a strong independent judiciary, election officials dedicated to an honest counting of the votes, and a strong political opposition, none of which exists in Belarus or Russia. Still, the United States has never before had to force an incumbent to concede a fair defeat at the polls, and merely by raising the possibility that he would have to be forced out of office, Mr. Trump has shattered the bedrock democratic tradition of a seamless transition. Let's see what's that. Travel zoom. The damage already done by Mr. Trump's obduracy. That's a new word for me. Obduracy. Could be lasting. Ivan Krastev, an expert on East and Central Europe at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, said Mr. Trump's refusal to concede will create a new model for like-minded populists in Europe and elsewhere. When Trump won in 2016, the lesson was that they could trust democracy, he said. Now, they wouldn't trust democracy and will do everything and anything to stay in power. In what he called the Lukashenko scenario, leaders will still want to hold elections but never lose. President Vladimir V. Putin of Russia has been doing that for 2 decades. Among the anti-democratic tactics Mr. Trump has adopted are some that were commonly employed by leaders like Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe, Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela, and Slobodan Milosevic of Serbia, refusing to concede defeat and hurling unfounded accusations of electoral fraud. The tactics also include undermining confidence in democratic institutions and the courts, attacking the press, and vilifying opponents. Yeah, like when did we ever hear any American president say the media is the enemy of the people? Especially when the First Amendment includes the press, which is part of the media. In the First Amendment in the United States Constitution. And the reason for that is because at the time they wrote the Constitution and added the Bill of Rights, they saw what was happening around the world, that nations would use their military to suppress the rights of the people. And the founders of the United States, in their wisdom, decided they're going to put in the Bill of Rights that you must have a free press, a media that should be able to challenge government or to keep an eye on government and see what government is doing. Because if you leave government to itself, government can become corrupt. So we find that with Trump, all of a sudden the media becomes the enemy of the people. And this is somebody going back to his New York days who loved the media, who was always in the media, calling up Howard Stern to talk and Howard Stern's show. Anybody who knows who Howard Stern is? Where they talk about sex, all kinds of stuff like that, all kinds of dirty stuff. And he used to call into that show. Like Mr. Trump, those leaders feared that accepting defeat will expose them to prosecution once they left office. Mr. Trump doesn't have to worry about being charged with war crimes and genocide as Mr. Milosevic, but he does face a tangle of legal problems. Yes, he does. Michael McFaul, the U.S. ambassador to Russia under President Barack Obama and a frequent critic of Mr. Trump, described the president's refusal to accept the results of the election as his parting gift to autocrats around the world. An early draft of the playbook used by leaders who never admit defeat was written in 1946 by the Socialist Unity Party, a communist outfit in the then Soviet-controlled eastern lands of Germany. Schronst in the first German election after World War II. The party, known as the SED, right, greeted its defeat with a bold headline in its newspaper, "Great Victory for SED," and took over ruling East Germany for the next 45 years. It never risked a competitive election again. When the Moscow installed leader of Hungary, Matthias Rákosi, watched as the Communist Party lost elections in 1945, he turned pale as a corpse, slumped in his chair without saying a word, according to a party official who was present, and later described what happened to Hungarian historians. Within a year, most of his opponents were dead, in prison, or terrified into silence, and he was running the country. Nobody expects Mr. Trump to follow that gruesome example, but by insisting he won a vote that results show he clearly lost, he has broken sharply with the norms of countries that view themselves as mature democracies. Trump's behavior is without precedent among leaders in Western democracies, said Serhiy Plokhy, a Harvard historian who has studied former communist states like Ukraine. Even in military dictatorships, the dictators more often than not honor the results of elections, and they retire if they lose them. That the United States has fallen in with such bad company has stirred dismay and mockery among not only Mr. Trump's political foes, but also citizens of other countries long accustomed to having leaders who overstay their welcome. After decades of preaching democracy to everyone else, said Patrick Gathara, a cartoonist and political commentator in Kenya, the United States has been exposed as drinking wine and preaching water. In November 2010, President Laurent Gbagbo of Ivory Coast refused to accept his loss in an election, suppressing protests with live ammunition, killing dozens, and dragging the country into a brief civil war in which over 3,000 people died. Like Mr. Trump, he freely used government machinery to challenge the election result, insisting he had not been defeated. The crisis stretched out over almost 5 months and brought Ivory Coast to its knees economically. With French military support, the president-elect, Alassane Ouattara, finally assumed power as Mr. Gbagbo, whose campaign slogan had been "We win or we win," was dragged out of his bunker in Abidjan, the capital. This year, Mr. Ouattara changed the constitution. And now this is the guy who came in after. Changed the constitution to allow him to run for a third term, similar to what Putin did in Russia, and declared last week that he won in a landslide. Even veteran dictators, however, sometimes concede defeat, particularly if they can engineer a succession that promises to guarantee their personal and financial security. General Augusto Pinochet, who seized power in 1973 in the military coup in Chile, accepted defeat in a 1988 constitutional referendum that would have allowed him to stay in office and relinquish the presidency in 1990 after an opponent won a presidential vote. But he remained commander-in-chief and was made a senator for life, immune from prosecution. Still, he was arrested in 1998 in Britain after an extradition request by a Spanish judge investigating his alleged crimes while president. A 2018 study based on elections around the world since 1950 found that only 12% of dictators who submit to elections and lose at the polls leave office peacefully. But military dictators, the study found, are generally more willing to concede defeat because they can return to the barracks and avoid getting arrested or killed. It is rare for dictators to step down, but when they do, it is because, like Pinochet, they have a feasible alternative, such as rejoining the military that allows them to avoid accountability for human rights abuses. The study by One Earth Future, a research group, said Mr. Trump's refusal to accept the results of the election has resonated with particular force in Latin America. Mr. Trump used almost every tool in his foreign policy arsenal against Venezuela's president, Mr. Maduro, who fraudulently manufactured a victory in the May 2018 election despite his deep unpopularity and a calamitous economic crisis. The vote was denounced by most Western and Latin American nations as neither free nor fair, and immediately brought fresh American sanctions. To punish Mr. Maduro, Mr. Trump banned transactions in Venezuelan bonds and imposed crippling sanctions on Venezuelan oil. And in January 2019, Mr. Trump recognized Venezuela's chief opposition leader and congressional speaker, Juan Guaido, as the country's legitimate leader, another major blow to Mr. Maduro. Dozens of America's European and Latin American allies followed suit within days. Mr. Trump condemned Mr. Maduro's usurpation of power and said that all options, including military intervention, are on the table to remove Mr. Maduro from office and install Mr. Guaido to the presidency. Just in September, the Trump administration imposed additional sanctions against what it called the Maduro regime's attempt to corrupt democratic elections in Venezuela. Now, Mr. Trump is also refusing to accept the election result. Tamir Porras, a former minister in the Venezuelan government who has since left Mr. Maduro's party, said Mr. Trump's refusal to recognize the U.S. vote delegitimizes America's role as an international arbiter of democracy. The argument of moral superiority that the United States had, he said, without a doubt, is affected by Trump's behavior. Geoff Ramsey, the Venezuelan director of the Washington office in Latin America, a Washington-based research group, said, "How does the U.S. government expect to call for free and fair elections in Venezuela when our own president wouldn't recognize the results of a clean electoral process in our own country? It's a propaganda gift to Maduro and every other autocrat around the world, and I guarantee they're loving every minute of this. Mr. Maduro certainly hasn't missed the opportunity to gloat. Donald Trump, here we don't lose elections because we are the truth," an upbeat Mr. Maduro said in a national address on Tuesday. So there it is. And what's even worse is that Mr. Trump actually have people believing that there was fraud. And some of these people, who knows, probably are going to turn violent to defend Trump, just like the stupid guy who believed that Hillary Clinton was involved in some like sex ring with little kids, with children in the basement of a pizza shop in Washington. And he showed up with guns from another state, and he went to the pizza shop to protect little kids. You know. And the thing is, from what I heard, the pizza shop doesn't even have a basement. So this is the kind of thing you got sick people, mentally ill people who are fans of Donald Trump, and they believe all the lies that he tells. And some of these people have their own guns in America, and that's what makes it so dangerous with somebody like Trump telling lies.